So welcome to week 2 of Intro to American Politics. This week we will be covering two important basic concepts again, state and local governments and the U.S. Constitution. So just as an overview, what we're going to be doing as a kind of a recap of where we have been over this past week, we talked about the principles of government and politics, and you should have a pretty good foundation of what government is, of what politics is viewed as, and in particularly the ideas of American federalism. Now, it may seem kind of disjointed covering American federalism last week, but I think that with this week's information, particularly about state and local governments and about the U.S. Constitution, those ideas that you heard about in American federalism will fit more nicely within the context. So, for this week, we'll be covering what are the roles, what are the duties of state and local governments, and most importantly, the foundational document, the U.S. Constitution. So, just to kind of recap where we've been so far, and I'm going to be using my approach, the game of politics, as a kind of basis for the recap. Remember, we've talked about the game of politics being a game about power. Who has it? Who wants it? Who wants to utilize it? And that idea of power leading to politics, which in my mind are the means of expressing governing power, political power. Once you have the means, the politics, you can then make decisions. That's policy. You can choose to act. You can choose not to act, particularly if you're a government. If you choose to act or if you choose not to act, that may give bias or favoritism to one group over another, and that leads back to power. So just to kind of recap again the idea of how I view politics, this circular effect, power to politics, to policy, to bias. And remember, the goals of the game is to get governing power, to keep it, to utilize it, to use it to your ends, the means of which to use it to your ends. Now, we talked last week about federalism. And if you think about this idea of governing power, we've got this swath of governing power. What federalism does, in my mind, is that it divides governing power up vertically, the national to the states to the local governments. And we'll get more into state and local governments this week. Eventually, later this week, we will find out that power is also divided horizontally, meaning across the board. This is through what's called checks and balances, or what sometimes political scientists call separate institutions sharing power. We'll get more into that when we get into the branches of government. So for this week, again, we're going to talk about the role of state and local governments. How do they deal with governing power? How are they structured in terms of their politics? What are some policies that are typically done at the state and local level that's more detailed than what we saw in last week's federalism? And then we'll talk about the U.S. Constitution, and in particularly how it was developed as the rules of the game. It also, as a governing document, creates the players and the fields on which they play. So I hope that you'll be able to take this context of the game of politics and start to see some of the pieces of the puzzle fit together to create this bigger picture. Now, as you're reading the chapter on state and local governments, here are some things that I think you need to consider, that you need to think about when it comes to understanding the role and the powers of state and local governments. The first question you could ask is, why do we have state and local governments? We've got 50 state governments. We've got over 3,000 local governments, but we have only one national government. Why do we have so many state governments? Why do we have so many local governments? Something to consider as we're thinking down the road. What powers are given to state and local governments? We'll see in the Constitution where the U.S. national government is given explicit powers. What powers do state and local governments have to oversee the governing structure of their societies? How have state governments changed over time? Certainly we've seen an increase in the number of states over our history, but those governments have also changed over time. Much like what you saw with federalism, state governments also change over time. There's an important concept when it comes to studying state governments that's known as political culture. And I think this is part of how we as Americans view our government. It's important to kind of understand the general concepts of political culture, but then also how do different states represent these different types of political culture. You'll see that play out in the chapter. You can also compare the powers of particularly state governors, the chief executives, to state legislatures. We talk about the national level, Congress, the president. At the state level, it's general assemblies, sometimes known as state legislatures, sometimes known as state houses, along with governors, the chief executives. How do the two, in terms of their powers, interact when it comes to legislating and executing? How are state legislatures different? We've got 50 different states. We've got 50 different state legislatures. You will see some real differences between all of them, particularly in regards to the composition, how many members are there, and the idea of term limits. This has been a very popular idea in American politics. Some states have enacted term limits. What do we know about those term limits? And then finally, we'll talk about how counties and city governments are structured as well. So again, these questions will be posted into Blackboard. You can use them to kind of guide yourself through the reading. If you're taking notes and want to study for your test off of these, I think these would probably be pretty good questions to think about in terms of the material that you might see on the test. Then we move into talking about the U.S. Constitution, and this is kind of the heart of this entire course. The governing document gives us our structure and our processes, but also helps to shape how the game is played. So some questions as you move into this chapter to think about. What are some of the core values in American politics? Over the past couple of chapters so far, we've talked about different values, different principles. The principles of governance, the principles of politics, the principles of federalism, the role and the principles of state and local governments. Now we're kind of getting into the heart of what are the core principles, what are the core values in American politics. How did the American Revolution and the Articles of Confederation impact our politics and the development of the U.S. Constitution? The U.S. Constitution is actually our second governing document. Not a lot of people realize that. But the Articles of Confederation was the first governing document. Why did it fail and we now have a U.S. Constitution? This is one of the core questions that I always consider and think about when it comes to American politics. That basically we are a system that is designed to create conflict, but also to require compromise. And that was found at the very beginning in terms of the creation of the Constitution. There were a lot of conflicts between the states over how the national government should be developed. There were a lot of compromises to create the Constitution. That tendency has been with us for a very long time. What are the Constitution's key features to structuring the rules of the game? If you're using the game analogy, the Constitution is the rule book. What are the key features in that document? And then how is the Constitution ratified? How is it approved? And what were the arguments for and against its approval? You'll read two important articles, two important readings about trying to get the Constitution approved through what is called the Federalist Papers, number 10 and 51. And that's going to be found in this section as well. And then finally, the process for changing the Constitution. We can change the rules of the game. How do we go about doing that? And then what has been changed regarding the rules of the game? What are some of the ideas and values that we've put into the amendments that reflect in our American politics? So at the end of this week, you should have a basic understanding of the role of state and local governments in our national politics. You should think about, if you're interested more in these two topics, I offer a course on state politics and also a course called local politics. And there we focus on urban, suburban, and rural politics. And you'll find those in the Catawba course schedules in the future. You should also, by this point, have a basic understanding of American political values. What we've taken over the past 2 weeks, you should be able to start to put together some core American political values. And then understand the development of the U.S. Constitution. How was it brought about? How has it changed over time? And particularly, what does the U.S. Constitution provide us in terms of a governing rules of the game? And then within that governing document, the U.S. Constitution also holds values. What are its values? What does it provide us in terms of the basic principles of American politics? So hopefully you understand all of those things by the end of this week. Again, if you have any questions, please let me know. I'll be happy to schedule some office hours. Or if you go into the section, Dr. Bitzer, I need help, I'll be happy to provide any and all information there as well. So good luck with week 2 on state and local governments and the U.S. Constitution. We'll talk to you soon.